Welcome to Radical Responsibility, the podcast dedicated to ridding the world of blame and shame, where we explore the issues you care about from a unique perspective. 100% ownership for each and every circumstance we face in life, day in and day out. Hi, welcome to the Radical Responsibility podcast. This is Fleet Mall, your host, and today I'm having a conversation with the renowned Matthew Johnson, Dr. Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins, one of the leading researchers in the emerging field of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Now, he's long been a researcher in the field of addictions altogether and done some really interesting studies on tobacco addiction as well as other addictions and cancer-related depression and other illnesses and human conditions that can possibly benefit from psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So this is really one of the leading researchers in this emerging field and just an incredible interview. So please listen in. And I'm really thrilled to be here today with Dr. Matthew Johnson. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Fleet. Pleasure to be with you.
So your research on psychedelics and psychoactive drugs has really been pivotal, as described in your bio, in reshaping our understanding of these substances and really as medicines and their potential as psychedelic medicines. So I'm wondering, maybe we could just start by maybe some of your latest research, especially related to addiction, on the potential therapeutic applications of psychedelic medicines.
Right. So kind of the latest is recently wrapped up my second study on using psilocybin for tobacco smoking cessation. This was an 82-person study, so we recently got into our 6-month follow-up point. This is 6 months after the psilocybin session, and which is tied to the quit attempt, the date that they plan to quit smoking. And so that's our primary outcome. So we're working up the manuscript now to submit it. I should be light on the results because sometimes sending to the prestigious journals, they don't want you to say anything about the results, but I'll just say that they kind of want to break that news. But I'll say it's still looking very promising. This was a study comparing it to psilocybin, a single session, actually, just to nicotine patch, the standard FDA guidelines for using over-the-counter nicotine patch, both with cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of the standard talk therapy to help people quit smoking. So there's some really promising results there that hopefully folks can stay tuned for. We are very, very nearly about to start the third study in that line of research. This was the first study funded by the U.S. federal government for looking at the therapeutic effects, actually administering a classic psychedelic for therapeutic effects since the earlier era of psychedelic research about 50 years ago. So really excited about that. That's, again, in the same line of research using psilocybin to treat smoking cessation. This is a double-blind study. So there's going to be a placebo group. It's a multi-site study with the two other sites right now are New York University and University of Alabama, Birmingham, with some great colleagues who have already been conducting extensive psychedelic, including psilocybin work, although the using it to treat tobacco addiction is a new aspect for them. Also it's a bit stalled, but have poised up an approved study to use psilocybin to treat opioid addiction, and also related to the treatment of addiction is some work also using LSD. It hasn't started yet, but it's approved. Using LSD to treat chronic pain with people that misuse opioids. So these aren't people who are full-fledged opioid use disorder, but are sort of one of the major funnels into opioid use disorders. Those people who unfortunately develop a habit, a pattern of using from its medical application, the medical application of opioid analgesics for chronic pain. So, yeah, a few different things that are kind of either ongoing or lined up to start.
Well, a couple of follow-up questions there. So the tobacco cessation studies, were those replicating your earlier studies, or was there something new about these studies?
So the first study was an open label pilot, so it didn't have a control group. So that nature of that study is one where you're necessarily constrained in the conclusions you can draw. However, one of the nice things about the area, really in terms of that study, to tell me whether we're even whether there's any hope here, whether this is worthy of follow up, is that we have an extensive literature in the scientific field of addictions for smoking cessation. We know a lot about what the range of successful abstinence rates are. And so we got a very high abstinence rate. That was a study with 3 psilocybin sessions. The first psilocybin session on the same date that was their target quit date for quitting smoking. 6 months later, we had an abstinence rate of 80%. That held up at 2.5 years at 60%. So these are just very high rates. Again, you had to be constrained about your conclusions, but typical success rates vary depending on your method. At 6 months will vary from something like 12, 15% up to lower mid 30s depending on the treatment. The best medication we've had is varenicline, trade name Chantix. Some studies have suggested abstinence rates in the 30% somewhere. So just at the absolute level of in terms of those absolute percents of people in a small sample, this is 15 people. So again, lots of reason to be constrained at the beginning, but an extremely high absolute success rate. So again, the question really was, is this worthy of follow-up? Like, might we be onto something? And the answer was abso-freaking-lutely, because it was such a high, success rate. And I think it really fits, like, having talked to now so many people, and now again having gotten to our primary outcome in the subsequent study of 82 people, I've just gotten a lot of feedback from people. We did a formal qualitative analysis trying to understand how it works, and it like across the site, at least the sort of the psychedelic therapy model, using a so-called large or heroic dose with an introspective framework. It really seems to be because of general mechanisms. People are taking a wildly different perspective on themselves. They can have insights. They have an experience that's sort of a touchstone for them that they could, draw upon in the future. It's basically a learning experience. People go through something and they learn something about themselves, about their relationship to tobacco. And it really, in many ways, the heart of it is psychotherapy. And I would say that about psychedelic therapy in general. Sure, there's a medication involved, but the way it works when it does work, it's psychotherapeutic process. Again, they learn things. They see themselves from a different perspective. They develop a new relationship with the issues that they've been dealing with.
So, well, we'll look forward to your research coming out soon. But you kind of answered one question I had, both in relation to those studies and the study with opioids. I guess people are on the edge or potential of opioid disorder, having gotten involved with opioids as an analgesic for dealing with pain that was medically prescribed. And I know this is a serious issue because I've had a couple of surgeries, full knee replacements, where I was using opioids to deal with the pain and get through the rehab. And I got no counseling from the medical providers about it at all. I discovered when I was getting off it the first time that I was having symptoms that I wasn't sure what it was. And then I thought, oh, man, I'm having withdrawal symptoms. And I started, doing some research online, and I discovered this whole world of forums of people dealing with opioid addiction. And they were all people who had started off with back surgery or knee surgery or some kind of surgery that created severe pain or other chronic pain situations. And then they found their way into struggling with opioids. So, wow, really important research. So my question, you answered I was curious if this was the heroic dose, large dose form of therapy with psilocybin. So that was the case for the smoking cessation. I assume that was also the case with the opioid study.
Yeah, that's the plan with the opioid study, to really use those large heroic doses, so to speak,
Yeah.
to speak
I'm
plainly.
curious about your thoughts about maybe the mechanisms of change. Now, you described you think the actual psychotherapy is the most important part, and the insights people get, and their understanding of addiction, and maybe reframing themselves and their identity. I know I stopped smoking 35, 40 years ago, thank goodness, and there really was an identity shift at some point where I was able to shift from someone who liked smoking, who identified being a smoker, but wanted to quit because I knew it wasn't good for me, to being a non-smoker and someone who just, couldn't even relate. It was really an identity shift. And I think those kind of reframings can really help happen for people through psychedelic experiences. But I'm also wondering, I have some colleagues involved in ibogaine clinical research in Mexico, actually, working with a lot of opioid addiction and having a lot of success. I have a colleague who spent his whole career as an addiction counselor in the U.S. and then retired, went down there. He's been working in a clinic for quite a while. And his sense of it, I guess this is an oversimplification, but that it kind of does like a reset on the brain in a sense. It's like kind of like pushing the reset button, which just gives an opportunity then for change, where this is where the therapy becomes very important. But there's some kind of, it creates a window of opportunity, maybe cuts the momentum of the addiction cycle or something momentarily, so that someone would have the opportunity to enter into a therapeutic process of change. I wonder how that resonates with you, or what your understanding is about what you think the therapeutic mechanism or the contribution from the medicines themselves is to the change process.
Yeah, I think something like that is going on. Of course, these are metaphors, and there's no reset button, and so It is a metaphor, but
Yeah.
I really think it points to something that so far seems true. It's consistent in the sense that there are threads of evidence. For example, in the non-human animals, rodents, we see multiple forms of neuroplasticity unfolding after psilocybin and other psychedelics. And while we don't know yet, it's harder to know if that's happening in people because, we don't want our brains cut open after treatment. That's how you discover these things in rats. It's a good bet that this is unfolding. I don't think that's all of this, because that's really, is an aspect that I think is not identical to these kind of larger scale psychological shifts, the perspective taking, the learning. However, it could complement those. You have those big picture experiences and you have something to learn from. And then if you have this neuroplasticity, that could enhance the ability, perhaps, this is speculative, to take hold and become the new normal. And I should define myself. Neuroplasticity is a kind of a general term, but different ways in which the cells of the brain, the neurons, can change so growing new branches to form new connections amongst different neurons, and even some evidence suggesting the growth of new neurons. So those are all different aspects of neuroplasticity. And to be clear, just plasticity by itself is not, by definition, a good thing. I mean, growing new cells isn't always a good thing. One form of that we call cancer. So it's, and I think that, and from that general perspective, it's good to remember there can be a dark side to psychedelics. We see extreme cases of where, be it cases of, essentially brainwashing. Charles Manson really looked like to use psychedelics to kind of, shape his cult. Wasn't the only thing going on, but I think that's sort of consistent with this idea that if you make a system more plastic, you can make it better or worse depending on the conditions. You kind of heat up a literal plastic, in an oven and put it in the hands of a good artist. and they can make something beautiful. Put it in my hands, you'll probably come up with something that might be mistaken for something that needs to go in the garbage pile. So it depends on what happens there. But I think that so that could be one aspect of the reset, the neuroplasticity, which again we don't know for sure is happening in humans, but it's a very decent bet, I think. Might be part of the so-called afterglow that's been talked about since the 1950s. People feel like this kind of the effects are over, the primary effects are over. This is like the next day, for example, maybe a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, but they feel reset, or that they are kind of able to take decisions as new ones rather than falling into the same pattern, just the habitual behavior that they've engaged in before. One other speculation is that there's these powerful effects acutely. In other words, when the drug is in the system, that the brain is communicating with itself in very different ways. These are so-called brain network dynamics, the synchronization across different brain areas. A lot's been looked at there in terms of the acute effects, what's happening in the brain when you're on the psychedelic. But then there's a lot to figure out in terms of what long-term changes, what perhaps there is a normalization of suboptimal patterns in those brain communication patterns long term. And so these are actually some of the things. We do have a neuroimaging component of that study that's recently wrapped up with smoking cessation. So we weren't doing brain imaging during the therapeutic sessions, but we were doing before and after snapshots with fMRI brain imaging. And so and this is obviously something that others in the field are looking at as well. Hopefully we'll have an answer in relatively, at least a few more clues in terms of whether some of this stuff is going on. But that could be another part of this, so-called reset, but just, anecdotally, and this is kind of consistent with the qualitative analysis I mentioned, the kind of the formal open-ended interviews we did with people in our first smoking cessation work. People do feel that they can have it's seemingly more agency. And sometimes these can fit into what I call the duh moments, because even when the person says them, they realize like what they're saying doesn't, a response could be duh. Like, what do you mean that doesn't make sense? Like one of my participants, I think he just like really emphasized like, I could just decide to quit smoking, like flicking off a bug. Like I could decide to quit. I mean, yeah, it sounds like duh. Like, yeah, okay, you can decide to quit smoking. Why haven't you? But people feel this very deeply.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think they are getting at layers of psychological process that it sounds like a duh statement because we don't have the language. It's perhaps part of the ineffable. We're getting to aspects of our functioning that we don't have a great language for, but really visiting this sense of agency that, wow, I could really have like this top-down influence on my own behavior. I don't have to fall into these same patterns. And so that's something I'm very interested in, what going into the future mechanistically at the psychological level. Really aside from the question, the philosophical, very interesting question of whether true like free will actually exists or not, which I'm not holding my breath that psychedelics or really any other research is going to crack that puzzle, sort of like the so-called hard problem of consciousness. Nonetheless, I think at least whatever we feel, sometimes more than others, like we have agency, we have free will, whatever that is. It seems to me like psychedelics can, oftentimes turn that up a notch. Again, it doesn't matter whether the philosophy of whether it truly is free will or not. Perhaps just believing that you actually have this agency, that you have this ability to make these big picture decisions in your life, analogous to these other disorders with the depression or how you're dealing with the cancer diagnosis, more in the spirit of the cognitive processes. Wow, I could actually change the way I think about this issue. I can change these reactions I have within myself. I could change the way these labels I put on myself. I can change the kind of this story that I keep telling myself. And in fact, I think that's very much like there's more in common than different at those deepest levels between the so-called addictions and the affective disorders. It's like these are both ways of falling to a suboptimal pattern. And it takes kind of like, often shaking up the system to kind of break that habitual pattern, which is one
Yeah,
way of saying, that perhaps that reset you mentioned, I really do think that's kind of a key. We have a lot to figure out how that's happening, but that's why this stuff seems to work so well, I think.
yeah, I think so. In the whole realm of research around change processes and social psychology and so forth, I mean, it's the idea of pattern interrupt of some kind, whether that's psychological or physiological, or in this case, possibly neurophysiological, that create some possibilities. It seems it's really important what you're talking about there with the sense of agency, because it seems like a felt experience of not having agency really characterizes addiction, right? The feeling of being out of control or under the control of something else, and feeling a lack of agency. And so that does seem to be really important. If there is somehow that we recover some sense of self-agency through these experiences, that seems really powerful and an important line of research.
And I'll just add quickly, like, I think also for the affective disorders, so depression, that lack of agency, there's a concept going back decades called learned helplessness. This idea that as a model of depression, that like you just basically learn no matter what you do, it's not going to have any influence on your life. And so you're just kind of you've learned that to give up, same thing, I think, as an addiction.
Yeah, I think from a strictly, scientific method point of view, the hard problem of consciousness that you alluded to and all of that is still, the jury's still out, but it seems pretty hard to be around the world of psychedelics very much and hold on to a highly reductionist, deterministic view of things. It does seem to shake things up and at least make one wonder about the source of things.
Yeah, I think it's humbling for people in terms of not being too confident that they know that everything there is to be known. And people wildly differ. And in terms of, sometimes this can go into the, what we may call the supernatural. And I feel it's very important that, we can't speak to ground truth. People have, spiritual experiences that could mean totally secular things like feeling connected to others, having meaning in your life, something any hardcore atheist would say, like, oh, those are important things. But then it could contain the supernatural, and so we really don't know ground truth. But whether it's at those levels or just sort of understanding the complexity of oneself, or the complexity of human interactions, or the complexity of the world, just to not be so sure about what's going on. I do think that sometimes that's an aspect that seems to be helpful with psychedelics. I mean, Aldous Huxley said it in an interview many decades ago about psychedelics that, some paraphrasing, but, very learned people, that have, they're very confident about the way they think things work in the world. Like, this might be an interesting experience for those people, he said.
So you alluded to there's some risk and potential dark sides with psychedelics. And I know you published a set of safety guidelines that I think were quite important. So I wonder if you could talk about that, about having established safety guidelines and the approach to make research safe so that we can continue exploring the potential benefits from these psychedelic medicines.
Right. Yeah, I don't really ever like to talk about psychedelics in any form without at least mentioning the risks. And so that paper really covered what I kind of see now as the basics. So just to very, very quickly, it appears that at least for some people with the so-called psychotic disorders, schizophrenia and related disorders, that a psychedelic experience can destabilize them. So thankfully one can screen out people through reliable testing, whether they fall into that category. I would say there's anecdotes of people saying it's with those disorders that they've been helped by psychedelics. I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm not saying that should never be researched. If as a field we research that, we just have to have even extra guards up, and there's certain things you do saying, okay, what if we are making people worse? How do we detect that really early and make sure we could stop the study? So just to make that clear. But for most things you're looking at, unless you have that on the targets and are really dialed in to navigate that, like, yeah, excluding folks with that potential is a very good idea. People with severe heart disease, most of these, at least the classic psychedelics, are really robustly safe at the physiological level, meaning at even far above typical doses, they don't cause people to stop breathing, cause them to have cardiac events like strokes or heart attacks, cause their liver to fail. Those are the kind of the big ways where you take too much of a substance, even caffeine or Tylenol, and you opioids certainly, and you die if you take too much. So with some of these like psilocybin and LSD, there's no known lethal, like, theoretically one could take 100 or even perhaps 1,000 times what they intended to take, and there's not going to be a mechanism for death. But that's for most healthy people. These drugs do modestly raise blood pressure and pulse, and so people that at that more severe level of heart disease, they could have an event. So these are the people who are at risk for anything. If your doctor says, oh yeah, don't shovel snow, take the elevator rather than the stairs if you can at work. If you're in that category, yeah, it's risky to, those are folks where anything, I mean, people go to the emergency department, things like having sex. I mean, that's not uncommon, so anything that like raises gets the heart going even somewhat can have that potential to push people over the edge. But again, fortunately, that's really easy it's very straightforward to check out. And there's some anecdotes of, people that have appear to have been hurt or even died, were in that category. And the only case in the medical literature I know of with psilocybin mushrooms, someone dying, is a heart transplant patient. So yes, that's an extreme case, but yeah, like in that category, not a good idea to really, probably doing any of the, a lot of these things that could, really kind of push the heart response up. And then you have sort of for anyone. So you pass all the screenings for anyone, healthy person, you could have the bad trip, the challenging experience. And that just refers to the strong anxiety, fear, the panic. And the really bad thing about that is if you do something stupid when you're intoxicated or high. So, I like to tell people it is relatively rare. I mean, you compare this to alcohol, you compare it to, cocaine and opioids, and the emergency department visits and deaths are, pale in comparison. But there's a reality here. There are definitely people that, they take a big dose at a concert and they freak out and they're hauled off by the paramedics and the police, and which can often exacerbate, things. But paranoia is part of the territory. And, hey, you don't know everyone you're around when you're in public. And sometimes it's, who's there? Are they out to get me? This type of thing. And I always like to remind people, you can't trust everyone. Like those are settings where you need to like watch your wallet, need to make sure for, especially for women, like, yeah, you should, maybe sexually assaulted, you're intoxicated in public. These are real things. So if you're in an environment where you're charged with kind of, keeping your guards up, that can potentially, kind of spiral. So that's why in therapeutics, it's ideal to be in an environment where you completely trust at both, the medical level, most importantly, the interpersonal level, the physical safety level, that you're going to be fine. You're not going to, even at the legal level, like you're not going to be, even if it's a small chance that, especially with the paranoia, oh, what if the cops find out I'm doing something illegal? Well, this isn't illegal. At all of those levels, you can let go, know that you're being kept safe. And so the bad trip is kind of the other aspect of other major, there are other things, but those are the major ones, the risks people should be aware of. But I would say I've become more focused in recent years. Those are the basics, more focused on some of these concerns that that are more difficult and probably not recognized by most people doing psychedelic research, but kind of the very dramatic psychological effects, the potential for cults to be formed around this, for power dynamics to be amplified, sexual abuses, relationships to develop. There is this sense that psychedelics break all the rules. These are bigger experiences that don't fit the normal rules, don't apply. And you see that, and well-respected researchers. There's also this sense of people, like, because people not always, but often confront what I call the big questions, like what's the nature of reality? Does God exist? What is meaning? What's the meaning of life? That people, sort of clinicians or researchers, use this as the opportunity to kind of push their own philosophy on people. And I'm very concerned about the direction that this is going to go. In fact, I've been, vocal even about, it's probably minor in the scheme of things, but a very concrete example of this is, why are we putting Buddhas in these clinical research session rooms? I have nothing personal against the Buddha, but my suggestion is BYOB, bring your own Buddha or crucifix or flying spaghetti monster if you're a Richard Dawkins atheist, or whatever, or pictures of your family. Like, why are we're not aware of, like, who is looking at this, who says, well, that's not for me, a Muslim, a more fundamentalist Christian, a hardcore atheist. I've seen people in all of these categories profoundly affected and claimed to have been helped by psychedelics. So this is not just for hippies. This is not just for political liberals or whatever one's conception of what stereotype of who would be into psychedelics. I've seen, political conservatives, grandmas that would never touch an illicit substance, former military folks, all of these folks, if they pass the, screening and, don't have those kind of disorders that might be extra risky for them. So I'm concerned about kind of pushing these kind of any particular spiritual narrative on people. I really believe strong, and which isn't to say we should be imposing materialism or anything like that. It's just that we should let the patient drive the bus when it comes to those metaphysical meanings. I think we just have to have this humility of saying, hey, look, I can tell you what serotonin type receptors hit. I can tell you some things about how the brain responds, or what the research suggests is how this should be used, most safely with preparation and whatnot. In terms of these big questions, what's the nature? Are you visiting different dimensions? Is this the realm of the plant spirits? Is this an encounter with God? My guess is as good as anybody's guess. I think we have to check ourselves. Anybody's guess. The patient, they haven't experienced. They're the world's expert at these levels of what that might mean for them, and they might not have any sort of thoughts on those dimensions at all, and that's fine too. But I'm very concerned about these risks, because we are going to see, I think, when this is in treatment, clinicians that are kind of having this cult-like vibe, and they're doing, sessions at their home on a Saturday night, and turns out then they're having sex with half of the people that are there, or maybe all of them, and this type of thing. And I just think we've got to have our guards up about, at these levels, that as intimate and as powerful as this can be, as vulnerable as people can be, that's part of why this works so well. But that also poses this risk. So we have to be very mindful of that and navigate these boundaries.
Yeah, I'm very happy that you brought this kind of expanded view of the necessary guardrails and the risk involved. Just to highlight what you were talking about with the elevated heart rate, and if somebody does have cardiovascular risk, I think ibogaine is unique among some of the psychedelic medicines to have a higher impact in that way. So people should be aware of that. But I think what you were talking about, because I know, sometimes in the world of retreat, even very secular things, there's often the host, the sources are kind of make assumptions of being aligned with kind of, a strong alignment with kind of Eastern spirituality, or alignment with liberal politics. And they make assumptions about who's there and who's coming, and create environments that may feel very good to them, but it may actually feel uncomfortable to someone else. And so I think it is really important to be aware of having that neutrality and letting the patient, especially when it's individual sessions, to let that patient design their own setting and with support if they want support. But I think you're pointing things that are really important. And then the other you pointed to is absolutely, I think, one of the really important challenges as we train more and more clinicians, that our ethical standards and training and it's just really important because for all psychotherapists, this training has always been important. The dangers of transference and countertransference and understanding how those can be employed psychotherapeutically, but at the same time, one needs a lot of grounding and good boundaries but yeah, I think psychedelic medicine is just a kind of is all that on steroids in some cases, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a great. I used to say under a magnifying glass, but that's probably better on steroids.
It's not necessarily that it's a bad therapist somewhere. We're all at risk for this. We're human beings.
Yes.
And, we all have the potential to think we're falling in love with someone and or whatever. And so we just need really good training and really good boundaries. And I think that's really important area that you're pointing to.
Yeah, and I remind people, because I've been in over 100 of these therapeutic sessions and talked to hundreds of other, folks for sessions I've supervised out, even if I'm not in the room. And I tell you what, it is pretty heavy to be associated with what for many people is one of the top meaningful experiences of their life. And for a decent minority, the most meaningful experience of their life. I mean, I can't put into words the gravity of that and how, I think just one has to be really humble and, feeling that they're lucky to be involved, that someone would trust them with that, and to not take advantage of that, even in unconscious ways. And I think that, it's something that's unappreciated. And there's just the potential, for example, there's a lot of talk about, the importance of potentially one's own experiences. I'm actually more concerned about, there's not a need, it's a complex answer to that whole question about whether, therapists should have their own psychedelic experiences. But one thing I remind people of, part of the danger is therapists imposing their own experiences on others. Yeah, you may have had 500 experiences. You haven't had the experience of that person on that day. You don't know what it's like to be a 68-year-old grandmother who's dealing with cancer or depression or whatever, whatever and even regardless of what demographics they're in, just that experience they're having. So again, I think the humility is something that can be lost of, just because no one knows the entire psychedelic territory. So one has to check themselves in terms of this,
some real risk
arrogance.
Some real risk of inflation there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in all the work that we do, I mean, humility is such a wonderful guideline, and just, and plus, having colleagues in clinical supervision and, lots of ways for others to notice if we are getting inflated, because we may be asked to notice, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd like to circle back to your work, the study you did on using psilocybin assisted therapy with cancer patients suffering anxiety and depression. So I wonder if you could talk about that study. Now, were these people simply dealing with cancer, or was this terminal cancer? So was part of the anxiety and depression related to being terminal, or was it just related to being ill? And anyway, I'll let you talk about it. If you could talk about that study a bit.
Those are great questions. It was actually both. They didn't have to be terminal, but a decent, sizable minority were terminal. And of course, that's thankfully
temporary diagnosis. Yes.
Yeah, and sometimes, thankfully, some of the things that would have been called terminal even a few years ago are not terminal now, or at least there's more hope. And so with more advanced oncology, so that can be just difficult to make that determination. But some people were, frankly, stage 4 pancreatic, with things there's. By any
strong likelihood they were towards the
yeah. But that wasn't required, and most people weren't in that category. So, but it had to all be related to their cancer. So, the depression and or anxiety had to have been instigated or exacerbated. So there could have been something before, but it was made worse by the cancer diagnosis. And there were some other rules, like if it had been an initial diagnosis. Either there had to have been a metastasis, or it had to have been years since the initial diagnosis, so that we didn't take advantage of just, say, a naturalistic. A lot of people are, understandably very freaked out at the beginning, but then, they come to resolution over it. They come to peace, and, and so we didn't want to, take advantage of that naturalistic kind of resolution. So for those people, it had to have been a year since their original diagnosis, and they were still suffering. And this was actually following one of the recommendations. If you read the older papers from the 1960s using LSD to treat cancer, at the end, several of them said, wow, this was such a dramatic and helpful thing that, like, what a shame that we did it during the last weeks of their lives. Like, because it would have been much better to have transformed people's lives that didn't only have a few weeks, or a couple of months, something, left. And so, that was in part inspired by that recommendation that, like, yeah, like, that's great to transform someone's life who hopefully lives another 30, 40 years,
How long were patients involved in the study?
Yeah, so that was the active participation was a few months. I mean, the screening process can take a little bit, but then there were 2 sessions that were about a month apart, and so there were 51 patients, and there was sort of what's called a within subject design, meaning each person served as their own control, and that they had one of those sessions was kind of the real deal, high dose psilocybin session. The other was a trivial dose, really. So such a low enough dose such that not even when everyone necessarily felt it, but serving as what you could call an active placebo.
Right.
So we ran, and the order of which they got was randomized, so people were kept on their toes, basically. And so there was, the preparation for those, there was 8 hours of preparation, and some people came from out of town or even out of the country. And so that could sometimes be squeezed into a couple of sessions. Often it was spread out over 4 different sessions of about 2 hours each. But then we had a so-called integration, which is really just discussion afterwards, like the day afterwards, integration sessions. And so, yeah, it spanned really over a couple of months. Their participation there. We had long-term follow-ups, but that was sort of after a long delay.
And was it a recent cancer diagnosis? Was there any uniformity around how closely this followed their cancer diagnosis?
We left that being really open. And gosh, I'm forgetting on the specific ranges, but we did have people that had long, it had been years, but they were still suffering. Again, the key just being if they were suffering because this does happen. People they've been in this dark place for years because of this, and I'm forgetting what the mean was, but most within the last couple of years or so, with the last year or so, but we did have people that they've been dealing with it for longer.
I'm wondering if you saw anything in the trajectory of the subjects of these patients' experience, anything reminiscent of Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. And I realize those are not linear, and it's similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, none of these have been scientifically validated, but they have a lot of common sense validity in people's experience. And there's this idea well known within the world of terminal cancer and people dealing with, shock and then some kind of denial, then often shifting into anger, and then maybe bargaining, and then the final stage of acceptance, even though people have reinforced again and again, these are not linear and they can show up in any way and you can go back and forward. But I wonder if this does seem to describe some of the territory that people are moving through, and then was this study, the psilocybin experiences and the therapy, sort of facilitating them, moving, I guess acceptance is considered one of, a good outcome.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I would say so, with the caveats I think you well described of, things aren't linear. But as a facilitator, as I said before, of essentially psychotherapeutic process, and I should say whether there's a nominal psychotherapy or not, and we didn't have a nominal psychotherapy here. It's confusing because there's preparation, which is rapport building, and that's very psychotherapeutic-like. In fact, according to the so-called common factors of psychotherapy, it's for many disorders, like the most important thing. It doesn't matter whether you're a Freudian or cognitive behavioral therapist, et cetera. It matters about that connection, that you have this safe framing, that you're moving towards growth. There's a rapport between, this strong bond between patient and therapist. So whether you call it psychotherapy or not, it's very psychotherapeutic-like. But I would say that, going through this psychotherapeutic process, which, in the best situations, and which is often the case with psychedelic therapy, it's something like, psychotherapy on steroids. And people do seem to more rapidly deal with those types of stages or go through them, again, not linearly necessarily, but that's part of how the resolution of some of these disorders work. I think we know most about that with trauma, and actually for a subset of these people, trauma is a definite, they would meet, criteria for trauma or even PTSD. We know probably more than for other disorders that, it's good. If it's successful, it's going to be worse before it gets better, because facing the difficult thing is the path through. Very much like the instructions, it's very meta, because that's how you instruct people how to go through the psychedelics experience itself. Like when it gets scary, it's like in and through, don't deny, don't fight it, but people often come out of this saying, hey, that's a metaphor for life. That's easier said than done, but so it sometimes does get rougher. And so that makes sense with your description of going through these stages of like, you may go through, you might go back to, let's say, denial. And as part of this, like really this cathartic like process of saying, damn it, like, why did the universe, whatever, or use the language of God, whatever, do this to me, and just like get really upset about it. Like you could prompt that again and to really kind of fully go through that. And that might be necessary. And then to go to the other stages. And I think, acceptance is a good description of how, like, when it works well, that people do get in there. And I'm also mindful any of these descriptions aren't, it's sort of like the concept of enlightenment. It's like, I've never met anyone who's, there are people that, like, I think all of us have had moments of enlightenment. And the more of those moments we have, the better. The more portion of our time that we can have our head in that right space, the better. So it's not like you achieve this level and you're locked in. I mean, entropy is a fundamental aspect of the universe, I think, including our own psychological process. I've never known anyone that kind of is completely locked into this sort of like at a certain psychological level. And so, whether it's the hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy of needs or anything else, like, you can be bouncing up and down, but to spend more moments in that acceptance, especially when it comes down to it, like in terms of making decisions, like, if you're enough in that acceptance, enough of time to say, I'm going to plan for that vacation. And you know what? Maybe I won't be around. That's fine. Like, I know I'm going to be suffering when I don't plan for that vacation at all. Because even planning for it is part of life. Even if I never get there, it's part of this process of, it's something to look forward to. It's fun. It's, and then, hey, maybe I will get there, and that'll be great too. And if I make it past that, I'll have memories. So, but like so many people, there's this pattern of where they recognize like the suffering is self-inflicted. They could choose to engage with life, but they're not because of the cancer. And this is one of those duh things, because they've told themselves that it's not like they didn't know it up here, but somehow now they feel it in their heart and in their bones. They kind of like really get it. They told themselves, I don't know why, like I could be engaging with, I could be out in like the sun shining. Why the hell am I not out enjoying the sunshine? Not spending enough time with my grandkids, this type of thing. But again, they now kind of feel it emotionally, and it's kind of this deeper lesson for them. And so, I would say, the more you're in acceptance, the more you're able to make those decisions to engage with life. And you're going to be back in the denial a little bit. You're going to be back in these other stage bouncing around, but just to have enough of that time in the acceptance is enough to make life worth living again.
Absolutely. And circling back to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she talked about the importance of living until we die, right? And so I think what you're talking about there is helping people find some way into continuing to live and engage their life until the end, right? So it's right. Those really wonderful outcomes if that therapeutic process can help that along. Right. I know you've been involved in, your research is part of the effort that's leading to the possible FDA approval and rescheduling of these psychedelic medicines. And it looks like MDMA is well on its way. So it happens, we don't know for sure, but it looks like it's well on its way. And some people feel psilocybin may follow soon thereafter. I wonder what you understand about that process and what you feel about the importance of psilocybin being rescheduled, and at what point will we be ready, have the proper guardrails in place to really scale some of these therapeutic applications for the benefit of people who are, whether dealing with addictions or they're dealing with anxiety and depression from a cancer diagnosis or other similar situations.
Yeah, I think your description is right, Fleet. It does appear that MDMA is poised to be the closest. Of course, depending on how you define things, ketamine's already approved, Spravato, right, and off-label use of racemic ketamine is used, but definitions is always an interesting area with the psychedelics. But MDMA, amongst the stuff that's left, MDMA is potentially within the year, according to the great folks at MAPS who have done so much work in sponsoring moving in the treatment of PTSD, MDMA for PTSD. They've completed 2 phase 3 trials that with promising data that, and it's going through those final layers of the approval process. Psilocybin for depression may be the next, because there's several sponsors that have at least engaged in phase 2 work. That looks promising and potentially approvable if scaled up to the larger numbers in phase 3. And then I would say, for addiction, both alcohol use disorder, the great work that Michael Bogenschutz now at NYU has done, and that the work that we've done with tobacco smoking cessation. Hopefully, all this depends on the data, obviously. I'm a scientist. Hey, we could find something. The results could change. Maybe this doesn't work so well as we thought, or maybe there's some danger we didn't appreciate or hadn't popped up yet. But depending on the data, I'd say it does look very promising. So hopefully within a few years, I would hope there would be more interested in moving, like for smoking cessation. I remind folks it hasn't been at the top of the list of what folks are looking at, but what some of the industry sponsors are looking at. But gosh, this is a big market, folks. There's a lot of people looking for help, a lot of like human suffering that can be alleviated, and just a lot of people out there. So I'm hopeful that there'll be, alcohol use disorder and tobacco smoking cessation will also, along with depression, will be within the next few years for psilocybin. In terms of scaling up, I mean, just to admit, we're getting to levels where it's not my square expertise for sure, in terms of like, the scaling of the healthcare system and the infrastructure of the availability of therapists. I could say for sure, the way Rick Doblin has been describing with the MDMA PTSD work, he's certainly correct in that there's an unmet need. We need a lot of folks that are going to be able to provide this service. It is professionally intensive. Most therapies don't require someone to sit there for 6 hours, and you're paying professionals. That's an expensive treatment. I think when it works, it pays for itself over long term, or at least there's that potential. We need more of the and I hope to do this when I have some of these smoking cessation results come through, do these kind of larger scale cost benefit analyses showing hopefully insurance payers or government payers like Medicare, the VA, or the government payers in other countries that this is pricey, but when it works, you're not paying as much down the road, and people keep showing up to the ER, and you're dealing with chronic illnesses, and so it pays for itself over time. Hopefully that's the case. I would think the evidence suggests that's a very, very strong potential that it is a good bet. But it's an expensive treatment. So, companies are exploring shorter acting compounds for these various disorders. So, I think that's a worthy exploration. I'm a fan of seeing the data for that, but there's probably a complex landscape. It may be that some people really need the extended experience offered by psilocybin or MDMA, or even I mentioned some work with LSD I have poised. It may be that some people really need an even further extended session. There could be differences across individuals, and maybe some differences across disorders. We just need a lot of exploration, a lot more studies to explore it. But And I would also say, in terms of kind of scaling up and disseminating, I do think we have been, understandably and for the right reasons, at the most conservative level of risk safeguarding, in terms of having two people in the room with the person. But I'll tell you what. Actually, in part, in the smoking cessation research prompted by the pandemic, when we were initially shut down, then allowed to start back, but only if we had some extra precautions in place. So one of the things we did was have just one person in the room and the other guide watching from a video feed elsewhere, so they could jump in if needed. And even that model requires someone to still be on task the whole time. But I think reasonable. Yeah, I don't want to have a treatment model that's so expensive that no one has ever helped. Right? We need to get this in the marketplace, and so that payers pay for it, and people are actually helped. So I'm fine for reasonable exploration, always with a mind on safety. But hey, to have someone else on call, they don't necessarily need to be watching a video feed the whole time. But if you have if they're by cell phone, or like whatever, a button in the room that, contacts them and they're on call, their pager, whatever, and they can respond to me, that you have that, so that, you simply need to go use the restroom as the primary therapist, that you can let someone know, and they're in there in a few minutes. They're there to relieve you, and then you can, take your break, what have you. Or if you simply, those times where you might need multiple sets of hands, if the person's having a real panic reaction, you can call them when needed. So I think there's reasonable explorations of things like that. Oh, and I should also, final things, group therapy. I know I've been curious for, going back 15 plus years on, like, obviously that's kind of the biggest thing we need to explore in terms of scaling this up, because, it's all over indigenous cultures, and, just informal trip circles, group therapy or group sessions are more of the norm than the exception. So I remind people, though, when going that direction, that, there's an art and science of doing group psychotherapy. And so, like so many areas, we can't just wing it as psychedelic researchers. We really need to incorporate that real expertise from people that have been trained to do group psychotherapy outside of psychedelics, and bring that wisdom and experience, that knowledge, into what we're doing. Because it's one thing to have like two professionals guiding someone and they're the center of attention, as it should be. But it is quite a different dynamic when everyone around that circle has had a profound or interesting experience. And then humans are humans. Someone's going to want to kind of hog the show, and you need to balance people out to get along with each other and let everyone else talk, that type of thing.
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed to that. I know some of the experimentation with group therapy is doing in some ways in an effort to find some way to scale this, doing individual sessions, but then bringing people together into a group for the processing and
Right.
things like that. But I really hope that as this research continues, that people will respect and really look into the really compelling body of research on group psychotherapy, Yalom's work. And I mean, we know so much about group dynamics that you put 6, 8, 10 people in a circle, there's all this stuff is going to come up sooner or later. We know this. It's just it's the psychology of groups, right? And it can be used therapeutically, and could be married in a sense with psychedelic medicines in some really powerful, beautiful ways. But I think only if we go back and respect this long lineage of group therapy and bring that wisdom into the process. Yeah.
Right. And one, I just think of one example I learned early in my, in graduate school with, in terms of group process with, adolescents who have, antisocial, issues. Seems pretty convincing. Like, they tend to get worse when you put them together, which kind of makes sense, because, like, they become the hookup for the other ones, for drugs or whatever. They get in trouble together, and and that might sound like, well, that's not going to be related, but the FDA they want adolescent research. For example, MAPS has plans. Hey, once this is approved for adults, that we need the research on the older teenagers, and then we need, if that looks good, we need younger, because there's lots of these issues, trauma, et cetera, in younger folks. So yeah, we just, like you were saying, Fleet, we need to recognize we're stepping into, this is highly interdisciplinary. We're stepping into realms that there is existing expertise, and we really need to just not wing it. We need to draw on that clinical expertise and wisdom, that knowledge base.
Well, I think we're toward the end of our time here. It's been incredibly rich. Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today, Dr. Johnson. Where can people find out more about your work in particular that would like to follow these studies and follow your work?
Yeah. So probably the most frequent place is on my Twitter feed, or I guess it's X now, but drug_researcher is my handle, drug_researcher. And actually going into the future, I should say I'm going to be within the next several months moving onto Shepherd Pratt hospital in terms of doing my research and moving away from Johns Hopkins, and really hoping to accelerate my research program and be in kind of in a more dynamic environment where I can get stuff done more expeditiously. So, stay tuned for as my career evolves and I make some moves in that way.
Well, thank you so much for all your contributions and the work that pioneers in this research and leaders in this research like yourself have just made this research possible again, and is really opening up so many possibilities. There's so much we don't know, but there's a lot of promise and possibility for healing for so many. So thank you very much for your work.
My pleasure.